And joining us now, William Gairdner. He is the author of The Trouble with Canada Still. A Citizen Speaks Out. And it's good to have you back in this studio.
Thank you. First time was 20 years ago.
I was just going to start right there because you did write the book, The Trouble with Canada, 20 years ago, and you came in for an interview on that. Why don't you, just before we get to why you think this country is still in trouble, lay out the thesis for what that book was? Generally speaking, what were you trying to say?
Well, people often say to me, gee, the trouble with Canada, isn't that kind of pessimistic? And my answer, quite sincerely, is look, this is kind of a compassionate love letter to my country, believe it or not. I call it the trouble with Canada because, to me, you can't solve your troubles unless you know what they are. And I think a lot of people run around, policy experts run around throwing water on the smoke instead of on the fire. That's why it's called The Trouble with Canada.
And you've laid about 550 pages out of what you think are a lot of troubles, obviously. But I guess one of the things I want to get to right off the top is how we see ourselves, which traditionally has been as a calm, compromising, pragmatic people. Do you think that's us?
I think it's a bit of a self-deception. It's a conceit, to use an unusual term, I suppose. It's a conceit. It's something you believe which isn't particularly true, but which kind of keeps you going, you know. And I guess the overall argument in this book, why I wrote the book, is because I think Canada has been yanked off its original foundations, which were rooted in British liberty. If you look at the first page of the first chapter, you can see that proud boasting of our original founders. You know, look, there are no freer people in all the world than the citizens of these colonies. That's why they came here, and that's why they boasted about it. And here we are, since the 60s and forward, we've become a very different kind of place. Somehow, for some reason, we exchanged liberty for equality. And I always say, look, equality is a fine thing. People have common human natures all over the world, but they're very different persons. And when you start changing your political system to try to change persons into, you know, the same entity, everywhere, you're going to get into policy trouble, and you're going to have to populate your country with police, all sorts of police.
Are we less free today than we were 20 years ago?
Well, I think this is true of the whole Western world. The basic thesis of this book is that the Western democracies, most of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, are out of control. Out of control? What are you talking about? I say, well, they're debt-ridden. They can't get rid of their debt. In that sense, they're out of control. If Steve Paikin couldn't pay his debts ever, I would say he's out of control.
But that's a financial issue. That's not necessarily an issue that speaks to liberty or personal freedom. Right?
It's a direct integer. It's a direct integer of the degree of loss of freedom in our country, in the sense that the percentage of government spending, percentage of gross domestic product, is a great integer of how the role that government plays in your life. And when it becomes debt, I say we have real problems, because we're basic, you know, all forms of deficit and debt are really forms of deferred taxation. And what governments are doing when they get to this is they're asking future generations to pay for current consumption. And I say that causes a moral rupture with the next generation, and they're feeling it now.
Okay, I'm going to get you to focus more resolutely, though, on the freedom aspect. I understand the connection you're making between the finances and the freedom. Yeah. However, almost 30 years ago, we got something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which you were not that happy about at the time.
A lot of people were not.
Well, 30 years later, it's one of the most highly regarded institutions in Canada today.
It is. It doesn't make it good, though. It makes it highly regarded.
Do you not... so I'm gathering you haven't mellowed at all in your views about this charter over the past 3 decades.
I'm one of the few Canadians I know who's actually read it word for word many times.
And?
Well, I think it's a noble-sounding document, and that's the trouble with it. It's noble-sounding, but it's not rooted in human experience. It's full of abstract terms which require judges to interpret them, because charters of any kind, this went for the charter that was famous in the French Revolution, a lot of our stuff was drawn from that as far as I'm concerned, to this charter. Charters are not self-interpreting, so you require judges to tell you what these words mean. Like, what does equality mean? Well, nobody knows. So the judge says, here's what I think it means, and suddenly you have a situation where in a country like Canada, which was rooted in the very idea of responsible government, the very idea that the citizens should have some role in making their own laws, suddenly he's transferring that role, not entirely, I realize, but suddenly is transferring major aspects of that role in the key issues of human life to unelected judges who don't know anything more about social policy or moral philosophy than you or me or the butcher, the baker, or the candlestick maker.
Parliament still makes the laws, and Parliament appoints the judges.
It's not quite true, because Parliament does appoint the judges, but I can't say it's true that Parliament still makes all the laws, and my worry is that one of the most important areas of lawmaking in this country, which has to do with moral situations like, you know, gay rights, abortion, capital punishment, all these kinds of things, homosexual marriage, I don't want to get on that topic, but I mean, these decisions are set up and created by judges, not by parliamentarians.
The courts make their rulings, and politicians, should they choose to re-legislate, can do so. They've chosen not to. They've chosen to accept the court decisions.
There's a difference between striking down a law because you don't think it abides by your Constitution and vacating the law entirely. In the case of abortion, for example, the court simply vacated the law. Why? The Canadians had said it's a crime. And what the courts basically said was, well, not everybody has equal access to the crime, therefore it's not a good law.
Well, another interpretation is that politicians, just by nature of the game today, are too chicken to do what they need to do, so the courts do it for them, and that gives everybody cover.
Well, you just wrote part of my chapter for me. The last chapter in particular is called Here Comes the Judge. And in that chapter I outline only half a dozen areas in which courts have made laws without leave of Parliament. And I don't think that's right. In fact, I think it throws us back into the kind of situation we were in before Confederation, in which these laws and judgments were made by judges in England. Now they're made by judges here.
Let me pull a chapter out of your book, or I'm going to pull a paragraph here out of the book. We'll read a couple of quotes during the course of this conversation. There is a silenced majority, you write, there is a silenced majority of Canadians deeply upset by these changes who feel that because all our political parties are now statist in orientation, they only rarely see their deepest values reflected in ordinary media by courts or by government. I want to pick that apart a bit. A silenced majority. Who silenced them?
Well, I think the media plays a large role in that, either by simply not listening, simply not talking about the subjects at issue in the ways they'd like to see reflected, only from one point of view, for example, usually a radical leftist point of view. In the chapter on multiculturalism, I have an important section which I discuss the three cohorts. I mean, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Class of Civilizations. You probably remember that book.
We had him on here discussing it.
Did you? Well, that's good. I wish I'd seen it. But I say he missed a part of the story, which is we don't have just a clash between civilizations. We have a clash within civilizations. In Canada, for example, we have your secular liberal mass of people who are getting about their business basically in a harmless, secular way. They're not religious people or anything like that. Then we have cohort 2, which is our faith population. These two populations are very large and they're knocking heads in this country. And then we have our very small cohort, but highly influential, radical leftist population, which is pretty much ensconced in universities, media positions like yours, and who knows where else in the country. They're very powerful, even if they're small in numbers.
But what are the deep values that you believe this majority has that rarely see to the light of day because of media, court, government, conspiracy?
I'll give you just an example without necessarily going deeply into those topics. You can find some of them in my book. For example, Canadians as a whole, when asked a fair question about abortion on demand, I'm talking about the right to kill an unborn child in the womb right up before the moment of natural birth, have never, ever accepted that idea, ever. How come it's here? How come Canada is the only country in the world with no law against abortion of any kind whatsoever? How is that possible? Because of the courts, not because the people want it. You cannot find me a single poll in this country which ever supported that idea.
Well, the courts made a ruling and the politicians decided to let it lie.
Yeah, well, this is part of my thesis in the book. I think that whole process has infantilized our people. It has infantilized us as a people because you're right. Parliament has become primarily a rubber stamp for the stuff that's safe. It won't even go to the major issues of human life, and I say that means we have an infantilized country because we don't dare even open our mouths about some of these topics, let alone discuss them in an open and fair and sincere way.
I know it's also true on capital punishment. If you take a poll, most people are in favor of capital punishment, and of course...
Not for everything, but for serious heinous crimes which have confession, we don't have it at all. In fact, if anything, we got, in for 25, out in 15. In my chapter on capital, this is a very grievous thing, Stephen. In my chapter on capital punishment, I tell the Canadians, you can't find us unless you dig,
Okay,
that 500 criminals released from jail, either prematurely or when their short sentences were finished, proceeded to murder 557 Canadians in a 30-year period. What is going on?
Not to take anything away from what you're saying. However, when this debate comes up, people on your side generally take the position of abortion, capital punishment, and gay marriage. And those are the three touchstones upon which we have the most striking debates in the country. But is it possible that on the great majority of everything else, the debates are mostly over, your side's lost, and on we go?
It's probably true. However, I believe we have a duty to be optimistic. I couldn't live without being optimistic about fighting for what I think is right. And by the way, over to your original question about the glorious document called the Charter, which I realize is appealing to so many people who've never read it. None of those things were mentioned in the Charter. In fact, the people who formed the Charter specifically rejected gay rights, specifically rejected rights to abortion. How come they're here? not because of the charter, but because judges took abstract terms in the form of verbs and nouns, and they qualified them with adjectives and adverbs that came out of their own heads.
Well, it happened in the States as well.
It did
Same
happen in
thing.
the States.
Yeah.
Yes. No, this has been going on in all the Western democracies. And by the way, I think that many people, not just me, are coming to a conclusion. This is sounds like a extreme thing to say, but I don't think it is. I think it's on the pulse of many thinking people that the Western democracies, as they are today, are becoming incompatible with human freedom, basic human freedom.
Let me talk about something you call prostitution politics, which I think gives a good sense about where you're coming from on this. And again, let's put an excerpt of the book up. A political prostitute won't start behaving like a good spouse until we ask different kinds of questions, making it known that we expect answers of a certain quality, or we're not interested. The only way this will be possible is if the electorate knows what principles the parties claim to stand for and can then connect the wild promises they make to their underlying political philosophy. You say we've got to start asking different kinds of questions of these folks, like what?
I do. I say, first of all, we have a situation where we do have politicians, but we no longer have many who are statesmen. What's the difference? A politician's interested in the next election, and a statesman is interested in the next generation. I say we have forsaken the next generation in many respects, for reasons I've already explained, of which the debt is a great measure, by the way.
Sure. Are there any political leaders in this country today who you feel are more looking out for the next generation as opposed to the next election?
I can't really name any.
Not a one.
I can't really name any. If there were, I would say, first of all, why don't we have a party, one single party in this country? I don't think they dare to stand up in the face of Canadian people and say, look, this debt thing, I mean, you're talking $2.4 trillion when you take unfunded liabilities into consideration. You're talking about a country where the consumer price index has gone up 600% in the last 40 years, but taxes have gone up 1,700%. Wages went up 1,000 in the same time, but not 1,700. Obviously, you can see an encroachment of government on the freedoms of the people in these very numbers. Why don't we have a party that stands up and says, look, let's face the facts, let's face the music. The countries won't go bankrupt because it can keep on borrowing from future generations who aren't here to fight it. But we're ostensibly bankrupt. Why don't we pay off the darn debt? Here's a 30-year plan. Let's get at it, folks. Come on, put your shoulder to the wheel. It's not going to happen.
Is there any party in Canada today that stands more for liberty than equality?
Well, yeah, the Libertarian Party of any province, or federally, if they have such, is going to stand for liberty. But I think they take liberty too far in many respects because, liberty is like fire. You can use it to cook your food, or you can use it to burn your house down or somebody else's house. Liberty in itself is not of value. It's a question of what liberty is used for. Edmund Burke years ago said it wonderfully. What he said was that liberty, when men act in groups, is power. So when someone comes running to you and say, I want more freedom, I often say that, you should be asking what for. And I do ask that, in this whole book, ask that question.
I'm sure you're still mad at Pierre Trudeau for what he did to your country, and I think you are happier with Brian Mulroney with what he tried to do for your country, but I'm not sure. Do you think he brought the country back closer to where you wanted?
No, I don't think Mulroney did. In fact, well, he tried in some respects, yes, the free trade agreement and various other things I thought were conservative, free enterprise, fiscal conservative things to do. But I have to tell you, how I got involved in politics in the first place was he sent me a fundraising letter.
Mulroney did?
Yeah, his party. And I wrote him back, and I said, you're too pink. I said, if you don't get more blue, you won't see any more of my green.
Well, he always said he was a red Tory.
That hit the Globe and Mail.
Okay.
And then people started contacting me. Where did you come up with that? I said, oh, it just came out of my head. But no, the long and the short of it is Mulroney actually spent more than Trudeau for the few years that he was in power on a per year basis. But if you look at, and I do show this in the book, it's shocking when you look at the fact that Canada had no debt for 100 years, except for wartime. The debt was insignificant. And then in the mid-60s, along comes the Pearson-Trudeau axis, and boom, it just goes skyrocketing. It came down after 1990. I'd like to say because of my first book here, but I'm not sure it was the reason. And now it's shooting up again. See, and I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it unless we face the fact and decide to do that. So the answer is no. In fact, two of the prime ministers who did the very best job fiscally for Canada were both Liberals, Chrétien and Martin.
Yep. One more excerpt. Our three modern parties have so trampled upon the classic individual freedoms and wise restraints on government power that made great nations possible, that made Canada possible, and have so tightly joined their coercive purposes to the powers of the state that all three parties, lacking any truly principled ethical standard, that could control the abuses of government itself are now simply vying for a greater or lesser right to engineer society. The result of this lack of principles, in which the only race left is for more power over our freedoms and wealth, is the reduction of political warfare to promises and personalities. Exactly what we see in the press every day: prostitution politics.
Yeah, and as I say, when I cite that example, it's very different. If you're looking for a spouse, politicians ought to be looking for a spouse in the sense that these are the kind of questions they ought to be asked by the people. The people, by the way, have also failed. They're not asking the right questions. And Canada has become, as a consequence, what I call a tripartite society. And that society in which 1/3 of the people are creating the wealth, hardworking people creating wealth. Another 1/3 are working for government at some level, federal, provincial, municipal, full contract work or whatever. And in other words, they're being paid through that wealth. And the last third are receiving significant portions of their income from government. Anybody can see that when this stage is reached, and I think we're there or very close to there, the last two segments will always gang up on the first.
But you make it, I think anyway, you make it sound in the book as if somehow the political parties hijacked the Canadian people and dragged them to this situation. Is it possible that the Canadian people have just decided in their wisdom that they prefer a more egalitarian, statist federal government, and they don't share your vision of the way the country ought to be?
Well, I think a lot of them do. That's why they're buying this book, and that's why I'm on shows like this, because people want to hear about it. And so, of course, I know it's in a minority, and I think that freedom, in fact, of the kind that and by the way, it's a qualified freedom I'm talking about, all the way through the book, is a less valued reality than equality is today. And that's why I say we've changed. We've gone from a maker society to a taker society. And I think it's wrong. I think we ought to go back because it's unfair to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and all the way down the line. We should be ashamed of that. My father would have been ashamed of it. My godfather went to Europe to fight against this very kind of statism, and he died doing it. And I think if he came back today, he would say he died in vain.
People want to be secure as well, and government spending equals security for a lot of people.
Look at the first page of the first chapter. Self-reliance. That's what we want in this country. That's what our founders said. That's why they built the Constitution the way they did. That's why they said provinces should have their own duties and responsibilities, among which education and medical treatment, by the way, were numbered. But the federal government came along and said, oh, gee, we got a checkerboard federalism here. That's what Trudeau complained about. He couldn't stand it because he came from the whole Cartesian tradition of rationalism and not from the British tradition of human experience. And what our founders said was you got to divide the powers. Let the federal government do what the federal government's supposed to do, and only that, and let the provinces do what provinces are supposed to do.
I want to pick up on that because you've called our freedoms in this post-charter era, quote, French-style, abstract, and judge-defined freedoms, distinctly not established English ones.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that the whole British common law tradition, in which Canada was really rooted from the beginning, I realize we've had other kinds of law too, but unlike code law, the French, for example, have a code law tradition which came out of Descartes all the way up through Rousseau into the European tradition in general, but especially in France. And of course, we find that in Quebec today. They live on the Code Civil. The Code Civil does not exist in the other provinces of Canada. And so the difference is that British law is rooted in human experience. It's rooted in precedent. Whereas the French code law type of political entity is rooted in logic or reason. Of course, that's a bit of a conceit because after a while you're going to say, whose reason? Like, what kind of reason is this? Is it good reason or bad reason?
But again, hasn't that ship sailed though?
Oh. Well, I mean, if I believed that, I wouldn't have written this book. And I think that countries change all the time. I think civilizations rise, they maintain for a while, and they fall. And I think if they're going to sustain themselves, it's through an act of the will, and that will must be an informed and educated will. If it's a question of drift, the direction is always downward. And my worry is that Canadians are being like passengers sitting in a car facing backwards. We don't know where the car is going or who the hell is driving it. We just see something come into view, like, say, Medicare, and we say, oh, gee, isn't that amazing? We thought that was great 40 years ago when it only consumed 15% of the provincial budget. Now it's closing in on 50%. Obviously, it's going to go, like, south. I mean, it can't continue. It must have been a mistake. And then we see multiculturalism coming by, and we say, oh, gee, that sounded great when we started. But look what we're doing. We're condemning hundreds of ethnicities to house arrest in their own skins. That's what we've done.
Countries, of course, lurch left and right throughout their histories, but do you think we lurch?
The whole pendulum was going leftward.
It is.
In the Western world.
When did it start?
Oh, it started post-war. It started post-war when people, especially, I mean, I think very well-intentioned, freedom-loving people, the original classical liberals, started to say, freedom's not enough. There's too many people who are using their freedoms in the wrong way. Look, we have poor people. We have actually, we have underclasses of people.
Okay, but Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney
They tried to bring it back.
And with any success? Mike Harris, Stephen Harper, they've all tried to bring it back.
Well, I think there was some success. Obviously, it was a qualified success, and I think that we're still living with the echoes of that success. But, you know, people like me, I would rather fight for freedom than equality for the reasons that I outlined. I think it's a fundamental human attribute. Without freedom, you cannot be a moral human being. Okay, and what does equality mean? No nation in the history of the world has ever been equal or made equal. The only equal society you're ever going to find in Canada is a jail. Yeah.
Which Canadian political party over the past quarter century has come closest to articulating the vision of Canada that you've put forward today?
Well, I think I would say, and I'm not a politician, by the way, and I talk conservative philosophy, not conservative politics.
Understood.
I think the Conservative Party, I would vote for them today because I think they are trying to do things that I think are valuable, but not enough of them.
Are they conservative anymore?
Well, I think not insofar. I would say that any party that supports socialized medicine, okay, which even the Soviet Union didn't socialize to the extent that they allowed private medicine to exist alongside it. Not Canada. We went whole hog. We were worse than the communists.
You can't call it socialized medicine.
It's government-controlled medicine.
It's a single-payer system of which 85% of the components inside it are private individuals.
No, they're provided by private individuals,
Right.
but they're controlled by government. The government says, you see, Bacon, you're a doctor, you cannot charge more than $9 for that service you provide.
The government and the
you say, sir, I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. I do better medicine than the guy next door. Why can't I charge what I want? If my patient doesn't want to pay, he'll say no.
I don't think the doctors are complaining about the fact they don't have any unpaid bills anymore either, though, do they?
No, and that's why they embraced it. And that's why the British who brought it in the first place and whom we copied said, we will stuff their mouths with gold.
We could spend the rest of the time talking about Medicare, and I don't want to do that because we're down to our last few minutes, and I want to know, you obviously have a burning passion to bring the country in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Have you ever run for office?
No, and you know why? I'll tell you why. People ask me this all the time, and I don't mean to flatter myself. I'm not sure I'd be very good at it. But the reason I do this instead is I say, look, I create the ammunition. You fire it. The reason I don't go into politics, even if Steve Bacon handed me the keys tomorrow and said, I want you to try this, we'll give you lots of powers to change the country around the way you think it should go in your book. If I took the keys and did it for 10 years and got it exactly where I want it, I'm not convinced for a minute that the day I left office, it wouldn't go zapping right back to where it is now. And that's a culture problem. It's not a political problem.
So you're trying to change the culture,
Yes.
not necessarily the politics.
Yes, the way people think about their world.
How are you doing at that?
Well, people send me an awful lot of very supportive letters, and I am proud to say, by the way, and I think it's a sign of how very good this country is. In all the years I've been doing this, I have never had a single hate mail letter, ever. Either handwritten, which I received thousands in the early days when you and I were first talking, or by email. Somebody argues here and there, somebody disagrees with something, but I've never had a single hate letter in my whole time in Canada.
It's all respectful.
Yeah, and I think that's a great tribute to our country.
You wrote the first book 20 years ago. You've now got the sequel out 20 years later. Canada is still going, in your view, on the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Do you worry that you're spitting into the wind?
No, because I think Canada obviously can't keep going in this direction. As I say, the medical system is crumbling already because people are being made to wait unconscionable amounts of time for surgeries. Even our own Supreme Court, good Lord, has stepped out and said, sometimes people die because of our waiting list. The Supreme Court has said that.
But
what kind of country hears that without blanching?
If we're constantly moving in the wrong direction, though, despite your entreaties of the past 20 years, why bother?
Look, I just have a constitutional inability not to fight for the things that I think are right. And I think everybody should do that. If we all did, we'd have a more vital, vivacious, involved country full of vigorous debate on all sorts of issues. And I think that's the way it should be.
That's a good place to leave it. William Gairdner, the trouble with Canada, still, a citizen speaks out. He sure does. It's great to see you again. Thanks for coming in to TV
Thank you for
tonight.
having me.